There we go. All right. So to start with, I want to thank you for that presentation. But I do want to remind you, you're at a meeting of the American Public Works Association.
Yes.
And we gave you 3 questions related to public works, but your presentation didn't mention public works or infrastructure throughout. Could you speak to the questions that you were provided ahead of time?
Sure. Can you just restate the questions both for myself and for the audience so that I can make sure that
I don't have those in front of me, and you have them.
Yeah, just how was public works and transportation, like what research was conducted on those topics during the 4 to 5 years of research? And then how were they incorporated into the proposal? We're not really seeing a lot of detail in the proposal on that specifically. And then how do you envision those services will be administered both during the transition and then permanently post-transition should the amendment pass?
Okay. So public works was obviously, I mentioned the 6 categories that we looked at from a municipal perspective, and I think public works and infrastructure are tied through some of those, but there was not a specific study on public works on its own as a part of our initial research or as the task force's research, and that's the first question. But I think there's some pretty important areas things that we found in our work in other areas that I think touch on public works. In particular, one of the things we saw, there's 2 primary things I would take away. One is when we looked at our Parks and Recreation piece that really is pretty heavily reliant on public works, we saw that, frankly, we do things fairly well in this region on that front. That was one of the things we heard from people when we did an analysis of what the situation was in different parks, both in their accessibility and their condition. St. Louis has a really strong park system, and that is in thanks in part to the public works that are delivered in the way that they are today. Obviously, public works extends beyond that to infrastructure and transportation. I think the biggest thing that we saw was that across the landscape in other areas, while we do parks well, there are obviously exceptions. One of the things we saw was there was, again, an unevenness in how those services are delivered, both in the ability to invest in those services from an infrastructure standpoint, and in the ability to maintain what is currently there. So when we looked at, for instance, our public finance study, our very first study, we found something that was actually pretty alarming to us. We just sought out, just for context, we sought out to see what does the spending look like in the cities, what are the revenue sources, what does the expenditures look like, where are we, to make sure, just to get a base understanding of, a starting point. And from there, right before we were about to release our report, we were looking through very frankly to see, are there going to be any embarrassing stories from folks who support us? Not to change anything, but to give them a heads up. And what we saw was that there was an interesting pattern of cities that had around the amount of debt that cities had, or frankly, what they didn't have as far as debt is concerned. And what we saw was that there was a concentration of smaller, both geographically and from a population standpoint, municipalities in North St. Louis County that didn't have municipal debt, which on its face sounds like, okay, maybe that's a good thing, but I think most of the folks in this room recognize that debt is often used to invest in infrastructure needs of a community. And so one of the things we did some talking with folks who work in the space, in the debt capital market space, and try to understand what does this look like? Was there a reason that this existed this way from a statutory standpoint? And the answer was no, but the reality was that for many of these communities, they did not have the ability to go to the debt capital markets and obtain the service that they needed to invest in infrastructure in their community. That meant that their parks were not open around the clock and didn't have this sort of things, because when they did have the time and the money to put resources in, they were very protective of it. It meant that they weren't able to do sidewalks and street lighting in the way that you would expect a community, particularly one that's trying to reinvest in itself and turn itself around to do. And one of the things we saw from that is that you're also not able to attract private investment if you can't have that public investment. So our inability to invest in these infrastructure pieces was really a detrimental thing to being able to revitalize communities in St. Louis. So that's one thing. The other piece is on the opposite side, where you are able to get investment from for instance, Great River Greenway, they partner with many communities across the region to say, we're gonna build the trail, we're gonna invest in this infrastructure piece. Well, the other thing we found was that many of these same communities, once they had those assets, were no longer able to maintain them because they didn't have the tax revenue, or they didn't have the staff to be able to keep up the infrastructure. And so I think there are some key findings for our work, but we did not do an in-depth analysis around public works specifically. I'm forgetting your second question. I think I touched on it there. I know the third question.
How do you envision if the public works services will be administered in the future?
Yes, so that is the third.
One little statistic that public works generally comprises about 20 to 22% or so of budget. So it is a big piece of the government.
Sure. So during the transition, I mentioned during the presentation that there would be, if things go according to the plan, there would be a vote on this in November 2020. If that vote is successful, there would begin a 2-year transition period starting in January of 2021. In January 2021, essentially everything stays the same, except that, well, everything stays the same on day one. And over the course of 2 years, the mayor and the county executive, as heads of the two largest combining governments, would lead a transition period that would determine how these departments, from an administrative standpoint, would be structured in this new government. And so, for instance, policing, one of the things they would have to do from a policing perspective is appoint a new police chief to begin incorporating the existing departments into the new regional department. It would work similarly with public works. So it's unlikely that it would be, even after they make that determination, that on June 30th of 2022, all public works is now going to be a part of this new regional government. What is more likely to happen is that they say, this area, okay, we're ready to expand service to this portion of the region, and we're going to bring in this public works department. All the employees who are public works employees in the municipalities would become employees of the metro city with their same pay and rank as they have today, and those things would be worked out over time through attrition as far as equalizing some of those employment benefits. That being said, that is sort of the broad strokes picture. Beyond that transition period, and in fact during the transition period, it is up to the elected officials to make the decisions about the exact way that things will work and be responsive as far as having a plan for the region. One of the things I do know, however, is that, as you mentioned, there's quite a significant budget for many communities is their public works department. So the way that the revenue piece will work is that much of the sales tax revenue in the region will go towards this new metro city to help fund it, again, with other sources of tax, the existing county property tax. However, municipal property tax, if one exists in a community, will continue to stay with that municipal district. Their charges for service will stay with that municipal district. If a community has, for example, a parks tax in their sales tax, that money goes back to that municipal district because that will remain a function of the municipal district. And any debts that are needed, so any revenues to meet debt obligations are needed. There's an analysis on our website that really goes through and tries to understand, based on current spending levels and current revenues, what is the breakdown for each municipality of revenue over expenditures after the shift in services. And almost the majority of cities come out on the plus side in that equation, because you're taking away their largest expenditures in public works and in policing, but they're still getting some guaranteed revenue through their municipal property tax and some of these other places. So what that means for some communities is they will have the ability, if they chose to do so, to invest in, if they wanted additional public works services, they wanted additional snowplow, and above and beyond what the metro city will provide to come through, or whatever that looks like for their community, they would have the revenue to do that, to contract with the metro city to provide different additional levels of service beyond what the standard will be at the regional level.
Okay, we'll get into the questions that we have here, but one thing that I believe does need some clarification is that by state statute, municipalities are allowed to pass a park and stormwater tax. So it sounds simple enough to say, okay, it's a park tax,
Yeah.
but a lot of cities use that for stormwater, which would be a public works issue, not a
Sure.
park issue.
Yes.
And parks and public works are two very disparate things in most municipalities.
Understood. That's an excellent point. I have to get clarification on what the breakdown of that will look like from a statutory standpoint, but.
Okay. All right, we'll go with more general questions then. We'll start off. Can you explain the difference between Unite STL and Better Together? For example, their responsibilities, how they're funded, who they report to, and will Unite STL be holding any town halls on the amendment since they're the ones who actually authored the legal language?
So Better Together, the organization that I work for, is a 501c3. We're a nonprofit. We're the ones, the organization that I mentioned and talked about during the presentation that did the research. United, and so we offered a set of recommendations through this task force process to the community, public policy recommendations. From there, Unite STL, a separate organization was funded there, or excuse me, established. They are a Missouri Ethics Commission campaign committee, and that is the legally appropriate entity to put forward any initiative petition and carry this process. So they are the ones who paid for the authoring of that language based on our policy recommendations, and then submitted it to the Secretary of State's office. And they are essentially, will be the campaign for any effort to bring about a unified St. Louis.
So in the future, they may have town halls, or will Better Together be the ones to continue to do that?
I can't speak for what they will do. I don't work for them. I would imagine they will have some form of public engagement, some pretty robust public engagement, if I had to guess. As far as funding, you asked about the funding piece. Our donors are available if you look on our website. They are listed there, going back to the beginning of our organization and different funding sort of categories and tiers. Unite STL being a campaign committee, they're required to report quarterly reports, and so that information is available on the Missouri Ethics Commission's website.
Okay. There have been additional modifications to the proposal a couple of times. When will the ballot language become available?
So the way that initiative petition process works, I'm not going to get too far into it, but there's a statutory process that lays out a very specific timeline for how things work. My understanding is that official ballot language from the Secretary of State's office will be available next week, I believe. I think they're sending something, they have to send something to the Attorney General's office at the end of this week, and so then maybe the week after next.
Because it's not until after that then it triggers the beginning of collecting signatures.
Correct. There's actually, even after that, there's a 6-month litigation period where folks can be, well, the state can be sued about their fiscal analysis or any of these other pieces, and then, yes, the signature collection will begin 6 months in. So, yes.
Okay. You mentioned in your presentation that similar type of situations happened in the past in Nashville, Indianapolis, Louisville. In any of those situations, was it a statewide vote, or did the local people vote for it?
It was different in each situation, but none of them are starting from the place that St. Louis is starting from, in that none of their structures of government were laid out in their state constitution, so none of them were through a statewide vote. In Indianapolis, there actually wasn't a vote at all. It went through the state legislature there in 1970. In Nashville, there was a vote in 1960, and in Louisville, there was a vote in 2000.
As a follow-up question, undoubtedly the merger would affect St. Louis City and county voters more than anyone else. So how is it fair that the rest of the state has the right to say what happens here?
So that's it's a great question. It's the answer is a little bit legal, which is what the path that we went through. When the task force was looking at the recommendations, I'll start with what I just mentioned, that the separation of the city and the county is in the state constitution. So any change to that relationship is necessarily done through a constitutional amendment. The regular way to amend the Constitution is through a statewide vote. There is a process, a carve-out process in the Constitution called the Board of Freeholders that allows for a local vote only that would entail the mayor appointing 9 people, the county executive appointing 9 people, the governor appointing 1 person, and they have a year to come up with some form of recommendation for restructuring the government. We looked very extensively at that process because we recognized the value of having that local vote only. And the reality was that it was unavailable to the task force based on the specifics of the recommendation, in particular around trying to consolidate the municipal courts and the police in the region. So anything that comes out of the Board of Freeholders, any proposal, would not be something that supersedes the general laws of the state of Missouri. One general law, for example, says that any municipality over 400 folks, over 400 people, must provide police services either directly or through contracting. And so you wouldn't be able, because of that, you wouldn't be able to consolidate police departments. There's another piece with the municipal courts that we know our municipal courts are typically managed by our municipalities, but they're actually divisions of the circuit court system, which is in a different part of state law. And so there's no way to get those functions through a Board of Freeholders.
The plan calls for the transitional mayor to create the structure of the new government, which will take effect unless a supermajority of the council overrides him. Why such an unusual process which focuses power with the transitional mayor rather than the council?
So the plan actually is that the mayor and the county executive, the two heads, the two co-mayors during that time period, are charged with coming up with a reorganization plan for the executive and administrative functions of the new government. The default charter for this new government is actually the charter of St. Louis County. And so they're charged with understanding how does they want to have these departments function and organized, and then offering that reorganization plan to the new Metro Council once they're elected in November 2022. They would happen, obviously, once they take office in January 2023. And it would take a supermajority to override their recommendations. But the thought process is that there's a charter on hand that has been approved, and they're only allowed to be able to reorganize the administrative and executive functions, things that they're ostensibly would be overseeing, or that position would be overseeing as a part of this new government. And so it should take a higher threshold to overturn, from an outside body to overturn that structure.
So rather than a ratification process like went on with the US Constitution, instead the executive proposes, and unless a supermajority, unless 22 out of 33 of those new council members oppose it, it happens, correct?
Yes, and then the regular process for charter changes is still available to us as well.
All right, we live in a very divisive time, especially in politics. While the city and county have party primaries followed by general elections, the 88 municipalities have nonpartisan elections. The plan mandates partisan elections instead, with patronage appointments at high levels. Won't this promote further political divisiveness and corruption?
So we looked actually pretty extensively at partisan versus nonpartisan elections, because one of the things that was sort of an old adage, I'm sure many of you have probably heard it before, there's no Democrat or Republican way to fix a pothole. And when we looked at it, we tried to understand what does the academic research say about participation in a system under partisan elections versus nonpartisan elections. And ultimately, there are pluses on both sides of it, but what ultimately the research led us to believe was that having nonpartisan elections on a scale like that would be disenfranchising to lots of folks in this community, particularly minority folks, because for a couple reasons. Number one, a lot of people, for right or wrong, look to that party affiliation as an indicator of support and who they should be thinking about in this election. That's not a values judgment, but that's just what the research says is true of that. The other reality of resourced or more personally connected professionally are the ones who end up running for office. And so we wanted to ensure that the system was set up in a way that could maintain and maximize participation from underrepresented communities.
I'm switching gears a little bit now to advocacy. If I was going to start a hospital, I would ask for advice from doctors. If I were going to be responsible for roads, I would ask civil engineers. If I were organizing a police force, I would ask police for advice. If I were going to develop a system of local government, I would ask city managers. APWA represents the public works industry, and there are similar organizations for other professions like APA, ICMA, GFOA. What professional organizations were included in developing this plan?
That's a long answer because we've had a lot of engagement over the last 5 years. I apologize that we did not engage APWA directly, but we've had input from folks in the government space locally and from a national perspective. For our police study, for example, we turned to the Police Executive Research Forum, the premier group on police research, We did similar things in other areas. We turned to Stiefel Nicholas in our public finance study for their.
Can you refer specifically to any of these organizations, though? The American Planning Association, the International City Managers Association, the Government Finance Organization of America,
No.
Missouri Parks and Rec Association?
We had some interactions with folks who were members of the City Managers Association at various points in our studies, but no, not in the way that you're asking.
So how can we, APWA, be part of any process to help plan for public works? From what you've said, there's not a whole lot figured out at this point. How can we be involved in developing and maintaining our infrastructure in this consolidated metro city, which appears to have ignored the process at this point?
Can you restate that question?
Sure.
Can you just repeat it? I'm sorry.
I'll read it verbatim then. How can we, APWA, be part of any process to help plan for public works services and the maintenance of public infrastructure in the consolidated metro city, which appears to have been completely ignored by the Better Together proposal?
So I will say that there's one. I'll come back to that. One of the things that I think is really important to note about the proposal that is on the table right now is that it offers a structure of government, and so there still has to be really good policy to go along with that to understand and indicate what good public works looks like under this new form of government. That is not a part of the amendment. That is not a part of anything that's taken place so far. What does good housing policy look like? What does good public health policy look like? That is not what this proposal is. And so there will be pretty extensive and out loud public conversations around those things leading up to and after the actual vote on this that I would welcome APWA to participate in and lead on if you're willing.
Can you tell us about how and when Better Together engaged staff or elected officials in the city of St. Louis and St. Louis County to obtain feedback on the plan?
There were many instances, and so it's difficult to.
I'll give a follow-up then. As a result of that feedback, what was modified in the plan? And is that feedback available?
I'd have to think about that because it's obviously a long process, and there was a lot of feedback. I would say one of the things, we heard this from citizens and from elected officials and folks in both places, the city and in the county and the municipalities. The piece about maintaining local communities was really critical piece that was not something that was a part of our initial conversations, but we heard loud and clear. From a procedural standpoint and from a just sort of cleanliness of a proposition standpoint, the easier thing would have been to pursue a model like Indianapolis has in a Unigov model where we combine all governments into one, or some other version of that. And one of the things we heard loud and clear was that folks really value the things that they have in their community and the local identities, cultural identities, and so that's something that we heard from folks both elected and non-elected. There are other examples, but I'm not thinking of any right now. But can I also just pause, because
Sure.
I understand you're trying to offer information to your residents. Your tone is a little
Okay, I'm sorry.
off-putting right now.
Okay,
just wanted
I
to make sure.
apologize.
Okay.
We asked the membership last week, we emailed out and asked all of them to submit questions.
I respect
We had
that.
about a dozen people submit questions. The committee met on Tuesday and we filtered through and tried to combine and consolidate.
I respect
And
that.
so I'm reading the questions that were provided. Public employees have to be cautious in what they say when it comes to political issues. Last month, a lawyer from Jefferson City submitted sunshine requests to the 88 municipalities, requesting all employee emails with keywords such as Better Together and Municipal League. Many of the cities gathered the data as required, but he never paid for it or picked it up. The city and county were not included in that sunshine request, and their top officials have come out in support of Better Together very openly. Public officials who have made negative comments about Better Together have been told that they risk 1 year in jail for using their position and/or tax dollars to oppose a ballot initiative, and complaints have been filed against officials in Shrewsbury, De Pere, and Chesterfield. Doesn't there appear to be a double standard and an effort to suppress opposition?
I have nothing to do with that.
Okay.
I'm aware of what you're talking about, but as the news stories that I've read, same as you, indicate and show, that's not from our organization. That's from an independent attorney and whoever his client is. And so I can't speak to that. You'd have to reach out to that attorney to get clarification on that.
All right, switching gears now to jobs. The St. Louis County Executive and St. Louis City Mayor have gone on record that no St. Louis County or St. Louis City employees will lose their jobs. How will jobs from the other 88 municipalities be affected?
I think those are decisions that have to be made by the elected officials in those places. But as I mentioned earlier in response to one of the initial questions, the folks who are in service areas that will become part of the Metro City functions will become employees of the Metro City at their same pay and rank. One of the things we know about the workforce in both the city and the county is that their attrition rates are pretty high, particularly they're just really high. In the city of St. Louis, I know for the last 6 years, it was 13% attrition rate. So there's a way to be able to get this government to be the right size and have the savings done through natural attrition rates. There's also, I think if I were guessing on behalf of the mayor and the county executive, they can't speak for those municipalities and what their plans would be under any new government, so I can't either.
Should the amendment pass, are there any residency requirements anticipated for Metro City? Currently, most municipalities don't have residency requirements. We've got folks that potentially would work in Metro City but live in St. Charles County or Illinois. Would there be residency requirements, and would there be the 1% earning tax applied then to the entire Metro City as it currently is within the city of St. Louis?
The residency requirements is again a policy question that's up to the new government, but my strong guess would be no. I think that's obviously been something that's been a source of consternation for a lot of workers in parts of this region. I'll just be general on that point, but my guess would be no. The earnings tax definitively would be no. It is phased out over the course of 10 years, beginning in 2022 if this vote goes through. And actually, I think the amendment is explicit in that even if you are, for example, an employee of a current government that is in St. Louis County and you live not in St. Louis City, so in effect you don't currently pay the earnings tax and you begin work and have to start working in the city for part of your job, you will not be subject to that earnings tax even during that time period. That money has to be refunded back to you. So essentially, no one new is going to be exposed to that tax, and the tax is being phased out for everyone over the course of 10 years.
Okay. With only administration and parks employees remaining in the municipal districts, what happens to all of the city halls, public works facilities, and police facilities? Is Better Together planning on using these facilities as satellite offices for staff? Would current municipal staff stay potentially in those locations and just work for Metro City?
Again, that's ultimately at the end of the day a decision by those new folks of this new government, but I think the scenario that you described at the end, where many of those places are used as satellite offices for these functions, is probably a likely one. Perhaps not all 88 municipalities, but there are clearly some very nice facilities, and having locations across the region is probably advantageous for a new government.
Okay. With St. Louis County, City, and all 88 municipalities each having their own ordinances, it seemed like it would be a never-ending task to try to incorporate all of these different ordinances into a comprehensive charter for the new Metro City. How would this be accomplished, and by whom?
So again, during that transition period, so on day one, so January 2021, all of the existing ordinances of the municipalities would become ordinances of the Metro City in their existing form. One of the things that has to happen over that 2-year transition period is that the county councilor is charged with identifying any conflicts of ordinances that exist between some locality and, for example, the county charter that exists and would be the beginning charter of that new government. And then offering recommendations to the Metro Council on how to rectify any conflicts. If there are no conflicts, nothing happens. Those ordinances that apply in, for example, Clayton today would continue to apply in Clayton until some action would be taken by the Metro Council to do something differently.
So to give an example, for instance, some municipalities allow chickens, other municipalities don't. So for the time being, they would remain in effect as they currently are unless the council decides to make it consistent across the board?
That's correct.
Many public works projects take years to develop and implement. Some projects have been promised to residents and are in early planning stages. In some cases, cities have applied for grants. Some have already contracted with engineering firms to develop plans, and some are under construction. What will happen to all of these projects if the merger takes place? Who would oversee them and pay the bills if the merger takes place?
I think, so I know I can speak definitively for any projects that are currently existing or underway. Those would continue as is. There'd be no change to that, both in the outcomes and who pays the bill on those. What I don't know is that obviously January 2021 begins a 2-year transition phase. I would imagine that those things will continue through that transition phase until a publicly stated demarcation point from the heads of that transition. So business continues as usual until something else happens, because the new government actually hasn't stood up until January of 2023. And so there will be an announcement ahead of time to say, this is the point where, moving forward, anything that is not at this stage of the process should be halted in that way.
Yeah, I think the example here is many of us use the STP program to pay for resurfacing projects and things like that, and it's about a 4-year life cycle for that, from the time you apply for a grant, get selected, do the engineering phase, the right-of-way phase, the construction phase. So it's a long life cycle.
Yeah.
So there's projects that right now that have grants applied for that will not be constructed until after 2023, and that's, I think, the concern that the group has, is who's paying the bill for those, because the engineering firms are doing a lot of work on them. They want to make sure somebody's paying them.
Understood. My response is that none of those things would change overnight, including where the bills come from. One of the clear obligations of and the priorities of this is ensuring that any obligations that are met from a legal or financial standpoint continue to be met. And so if there's still outstanding debt with a municipality, for example, on a project, or outstanding obligations, that obligation remains with that municipality, but also the obligation for the Metro City to ensure that they have the dollars to meet that obligation.
There are significant differences in the services and amenities provided throughout the city and county. How will the level of service be determined, such as snow plowing, potholes, tree clearance, design standards, for the combined Metro City, and how will that compare to the varying levels of service currently provided by each of the municipalities?
So I was trying to avoid saying what I'm going to say, which is that at the end of the day, that's a decision by the elected officials of the new government. Once they have the departments, they have to come up with a plan for this region on how they want to deliver those services and how to distribute those resources within the system.
I think the example here is, as far as snow plowing, for instance, not to beat on the city of St. Louis, but we know they don't plow the neighborhood streets. I lived in South City. I know it's just fact of life. The plows can't get down the streets. I think Todd would agree with that. It's just physics. So, but out in most municipalities, the expectation is the streets are going to get plowed. So what's the level of service somewhere in between there?
Well, I think the default is that things continue as they are today, and just what government is responsible for the oversight of that shifts in the beginning. And then if for some reason the service needs to expand or contract based on whatever the realities are at that time, those decisions have to be made by the elected officials and the officials of the new government.
I guess some of that goes back to the equity discussion, talk about equity of services in the beginning. So it's a matter of, is it can be consistent across the board, or is it going to stay as it currently is? It's to be determined, is what you're saying.
To be determined. Initially, it will be as it is. The goal would obviously be to bring it to an equitable level, but there's clearly a number of factors that go into that decision from a budgetary standpoint, from a resources standpoint. So, I'll just be frank with you and everyone in this room. One of the more frustrating parts of this for us was the recognition that we wouldn't be able to answer some of those questions, because at some point, the leaders of this new government have to be able to run the new government. And I know that that's deeply dissatisfying, but it's sort of, this is what we're offering as a framework for how we can be structured, and that is the reality of how that would have to work.
Okay. If the municipal districts, you mentioned that they can levy additional taxes to improve the level of service over the baseline level. How would that be administered? What employees would, there's not going to be any public works employees left in municipality X. Who is going to be the person who manages that additional level of service?
So the way that would work is if they have existing revenue or wanted to try to collect additional revenue, whether that be through utility taxes or local property taxes, they would have that ability to do that, and then contract with the Metro City for additional services beyond what the Metro City provides at a base level. So if the Metro City says this is our level of service, and community says we would like to have this level of service, obviously that would be written into a contract, and and those funds would be sent to the Metro City to provide that level of service.
So the additional service would still be provided by the Metro City. It's not like
That's
the municipality would establish its own
That's
separate
correct.
additional
That's correct.
department. Okay.
The exception there is if there's a service, but Public Works isn't one of them, but just to be for clarity, if there's a service that's not provided by the Metro City, they would have the authority to provide that service locally, wholly administered by them.
Can you give an example of that?
I can't, but the language allows for that because I can't think of one. But the language allows for that if there is something that, I guess one would be trash, would be a good example of that. The Metro City doesn't provide trash. It won't provide trash service. If they wanted to have if the city wanted to have its own trash department, they could potentially do something like that.
Okay. Well, that leads us to the end of our questions. It is past 1:30, so if we had gotten done earlier, we were potentially going to open it up, but because we've gone past 1:30, we're going to wrap it up. I guess I'll give you a chance if you got any closing statements before we wrap up here.
Yeah, I would just say thank you for allowing me the opportunity to come in and speak about some of the issues related, particularly some of the issues that your organization is really interested in. I encourage you to continue this conversation, whether it be here or in your own communities. If you would like to have a speaker from Better Together come to another organization that you're a part of, whether it's Public Works or civil engineer related, or just a neighborhood association or other civic group that you're a part of, we would love that. We would welcome that opportunity. Check out our website, bettertogetherstl.com. There you can learn more about the proposal and request a speaker or get more information or submit a question for further information. Thank you.
Thank you, Marius, for coming today and speaking about this very interesting and important topic. And we have a certificate of appreciation and a gift card for you.
Thank you.
So a reminder, our next meeting in May is our annual picnic.